I worked 35 years as a nurse, and the first time I truly felt helpless was the moment I heard the sharp click of a padlock on my own bedroom door. The sound echoed down the quiet hallway like a verdict already decided, cold and final. Ashley stood there with the small brass key still between her manicured fingers, her expression calm in a way that made my stomach tighten. "You don't live here anymore, Margaret," she said, as if she were reminding me about a forgotten appointment. My son Daniel was leaning against the kitchen counter a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor tiles we had chosen together nearly 2 decades ago. He didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. I remember noticing the way the late afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood, catching on the dust that had started to gather since my husband passed 3 weeks earlier. Grief has a way of making even the most careful housekeeper careless. I set down the folded laundry I had been carrying, a stack of Daniel's shirts I still washed out of habit, and studied the lock as if it were some unfamiliar medical device I had to understand before the patient stopped breathing. For 35 years I had stayed calm in emergency rooms filled with chaos, had counted heartbeats while families cried, had delivered bad news with a steady voice because that was what people needed. Now my training returned to me like muscle memory. Breathe. Observe. Don't panic. "Ashley," I said quietly, "what exactly are you doing?" She smiled in that polite way she used with strangers at church fundraisers. "We talked about this. It's time for you to start making other arrangements." Daniel shifted his weight but still said nothing. The silence between us was heavier than any hospital night shift I had ever worked. I thought about the countless evenings I had driven home exhausted at 2 in the morning, my scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee, only to find Daniel asleep on the couch waiting for me because he didn't like going to bed without saying goodnight. I thought about the tuition checks, the birthday cakes baked after double shifts, the mortgage payments I had helped cover when his first job didn't pay enough. All of it seemed to hover in the air now like ghosts no one else could see. Ashley turned the key once more to make sure the lock was secure. The small metal click sounded louder this time, almost deliberate. "You'll still have your things," she added. "We're just reorganizing the house." Reorganizing. Such a tidy word for something that felt like being erased. I nodded slowly, surprising even myself with the steadiness of my hands. In the emergency room, panic only makes things worse. You learn to focus on what can still be saved. I picked up the laundry again and carried it to the living room, placing it neatly on the armchair Daniel used to sit in when he called me for advice about everything from broken appliances to broken relationships. He watched me pass but didn't reach out. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled down Maple Street, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked at nothing. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly shifted under my feet. "You can stay in the guest room for now," Ashley said from behind me, her tone already moving on to the next item on her invisible list. I walked to the window and looked out at the small garden my husband had planted the summer before his heart attack, the roses just beginning to bloom despite the early spring chill. I remembered telling a young nurse once that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about patience. Sometimes it's about letting people believe you're weaker than you are. I turned back to them with a faint smile that felt unfamiliar on my own face. The hallway was silent again. The lock gleamed softly under the ceiling light. And in that quiet moment, I realized this was not the end of my story. It was only the moment when I finally understood what kind of fight I was in. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender and old cardboard, the kind of scent that lingers in spaces meant for temporary stays. I sat on the edge of the narrow twin bed and listened to the quiet hum of the house that had once felt like an extension of my own heartbeat. For years I had known every creak of these floors, every flicker of the kitchen light that needed a gentle tap to stay on. Now each sound felt unfamiliar, as if I were a visitor memorizing the layout of someone else's life. Through the thin wall, I could hear Ashley moving about with purposeful energy, cabinet doors opening and closing, the low murmur of her voice as she spoke to Daniel in tones too soft for me to catch the words. The clock on the bedside table read 6:47 in the evening, the same time I would normally begin preparing dinner after a long shift at St. Matthew's Medical Center. Routine has a way of anchoring a person, and without it the hours stretched strangely, like a hallway with no end in sight. I folded my hands in my lap and let my mind drift back to the last normal day I could remember, just 48 hours earlier, when the kitchen had still felt like mine. I had stood at the stove stirring a pot of chicken soup, the steam fogging the window above the sink while early spring rain tapped softly against the glass. Daniel had come home late from work, loosening his tie the way he always did, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl I had bought at a charity sale years ago. Ashley had followed him in, smiling brightly, talking about a new furniture catalog she had discovered. Nothing in their voices had warned me that the ground beneath my feet was already beginning to shift. We had eaten together at the round oak table my husband built with his own hands, passing the salt, discussing the rising cost of property taxes, making plans for the weekend as though we were still a family moving in the same direction. I remember noticing then how often Ashley checked her phone, her expression tightening each time the screen lit up, but I told myself it was none of my business. A nurse learns early that not every symptom signals a crisis. Some things resolve on their own. After dinner I had washed the dishes while Daniel watched the evening news, the familiar rhythm of water and porcelain calming me in ways I did not fully understand until now. He had thanked me for the meal with a distracted pat on my shoulder, already half turned toward his wife as she showed him something on her tablet. It was such an ordinary moment that I nearly missed the quiet distance growing between us, like a tide receding before a storm. Back in the guest room, I rose and opened the small closet, running my fingers along the row of empty hangers that clinked together like wind chimes. My belongings were still in my locked bedroom down the hall, sealed away behind that polished piece of metal that seemed to grow heavier in my thoughts with each passing minute. I told myself to stay calm, to gather information the way I would before assisting in a complicated procedure. Panic clouds judgment. Patience reveals truth. Outside the window the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pale circles onto the damp pavement. Somewhere in the house Ashley laughed softly at something Daniel said, a sound so light it might have belonged to strangers. I lay down fully dressed on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint water stains left by a leak long since repaired. In hospitals I had often sat beside patients through long uncertain nights, reminding them that morning always comes, whether we are ready for it or not. As sleep finally crept over me in thin restless waves, I realized that my own long night had only just begun, and that whatever was unfolding under this roof would require the same steady heart I had carried through every crisis of my working life. I woke before sunrise to the unfamiliar stillness that settles over a house when people begin living separate lives under the same roof. For a few seconds I forgot where I was, reaching instinctively toward the nightstand for the alarm clock that had stood beside my bed for 25 years, only to find empty air and the faint roughness of painted drywall. The guest room window faced east, and a thin ribbon of pale light had already begun to slip through the curtains, stretching slowly across the carpet like a quiet reminder that time does not pause for anyone. I sat up and listened, the way I used to during overnight shifts when every unusual sound could signal a patient in distress. Somewhere down the hall a drawer opened and closed with a soft thud. The coffee maker clicked on. Ashley moved through the kitchen with brisk efficiency, humming under her breath, while Daniel's footsteps followed at a measured distance behind her. Their routine had continued seamlessly without me, as if I had simply been removed from the schedule. I folded the thin blanket at the foot of the bed and placed it carefully on the chair, small acts of order that helped steady my thoughts. After 35 years in medicine, I knew that clarity often begins with observation. When I stepped into the hallway, the first thing I noticed was the absence of my framed photographs from the console table. The spot where they had stood was marked by faint rectangular outlines in the dust, silent evidence that something had been rearranged while I slept. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, counting my breaths the way I had taught anxious patients to do before surgery. Daniel glanced up when he saw me, offering a tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Ashley handed him a travel mug and continued scrolling through her phone, her expression composed, already miles away from the small domestic scene unfolding around her. "There is cereal in the pantry," she said without looking up, her tone polite but distant, as though speaking to a temporary houseguest. I nodded and poured myself a glass of water instead, the tap running colder than usual, or perhaps it was only my hands that had grown unsteady. On the kitchen counter lay a neat stack of envelopes I did not recognize, each bearing Daniel's name in bold black print. I caught a glimpse of official logos, unfamiliar company names, numbers that seemed to carry more weight than their ink suggested. When Daniel noticed where my gaze had fallen, he shifted the paper slightly, A small protective movement that told me more than any explanation could have. In the emergency room, families often tried to hide their fear behind ordinary gestures, straightening blankets, adjusting pillows, believing that if they could control the details they could control the outcome. I recognized that same quiet urgency now. Later that morning I returned to the hallway and paused outside my locked bedroom, studying the polished surface of the padlock as though it might reveal its secrets if I looked long enough. The metal reflected my face in a warped, distant way, silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes that had witnessed too many crises to be easily fooled. From behind the door I imagined the familiar scent of cedar drawers and pressed linens, the rhythm of a life built carefully over decades now reduced to an inaccessible memory. A faint murmur drifted from the living room where Ashley spoke on the phone, her voice lowered, but edged with excitement. I caught fragments of phrases carried on the air, words like appraisal, closing date, and potential buyers, each one landing with the quiet precision of a diagnosis finally confirmed. I did not interrupt. Instead I stood very still, allowing the realization to settle over me like a sterile sheet placed gently across a patient before an operation. Whatever plans were being made no longer included my consent, and yet something deep within me remained calm. I had learned long ago that the most important decisions are often made in silence, in the measured space between shock and response. As the morning sun climbed higher, filling the hallway with a brighter, almost unforgiving light, I turned away from the locked door and walked toward the front porch, feeling the cool boards beneath my feet, the distant sound of traffic beginning to swell along Maple Street. Somewhere inside the house Daniel laughed at something Ashley said, a brief easy sound that felt strangely out of place. I rested my hand on the porch railing and looked out at the quiet neighborhood we had once chosen together, understanding at last that the situation unfolding around me was not an accident of grief or misunderstanding, but a carefully arranged shift in power. And for the first time since hearing that small decisive click of metal, I began to consider not only what I had lost, but what I might still be able to reclaim. The afternoon light had begun to soften by the time I returned inside, carrying with me the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a passing school bus. Life in the neighborhood continued with its usual quiet determination, children laughing somewhere beyond the hedges, a lawn mower starting up 2 houses down, ordinary sounds that once made me feel rooted and safe. Now they only reminded me how easily a person can become invisible in a place she helped build. I moved slowly through the living room, my steps measured, my mind already cataloging every small change as if I were reviewing a patient's chart. The throw blanket I had crocheted during long winter evenings was folded differently across the back of the sofa. A new decorative tray had appeared on the coffee table, holding glossy real estate brochures that had not been there the day before. Their edges were perfectly aligned, their photographs bright with promise, smiling families standing in sunlit kitchens that all seemed to blur together. I paused beside them, allowing my fingers to rest lightly on the paper without picking it up. In the hospital we were trained never to disturb a sterile field unless absolutely necessary. Information reveals itself in time. From the kitchen came the rhythmic tapping of Ashley's nails against her phone screen, a sound that had grown increasingly familiar in recent weeks. Daniel's voice followed, lower, uncertain, as though he were trying to convince both of them that whatever path they had chosen was the only reasonable one. I remembered a different version of his voice from years ago, small and frightened when he had fallen from his bicycle and scraped his knees on the gravel driveway. I had cleaned the wound with careful hands, explaining each step so he would not be afraid. Pain can be managed, I told him then. Fear is harder. That memory lingered now like a quiet ache beneath my ribs. I walked toward the hallway once more, drawn by the silent presence of the locked door that seemed to anchor every thought I had. The brass surface caught the fading sunlight, reflecting it in thin fractured lines across the wall. Behind it lay more than just clothing and personal belongings. Behind it lay decades of night shifts, overtime hours, birthdays missed and holidays postponed, every sacrifice measured in 12-hour increments and spent without regret, because I believed I was investing in something lasting. A sudden burst of laughter drifted from the kitchen, Ashley's voice bright with satisfaction. I could hear her mentioning square footage and market value, phrases that felt oddly clinical, as if she were discussing a case study rather than the home where my husband's boots still stood by the back door. For a moment the urge to confront them rose sharply within me, a reflex born from years of advocating for patients who could not speak for themselves. Yet I let the feeling pass, the way one allows a wave to break harmlessly against a solid shore. Confrontation without preparation achieves little. I turned instead toward the small desk tucked beneath the staircase, a place I had once used to organize medical bills and school forms. The drawer slid open with a soft wooden sigh, revealing a scattering of old envelopes, a checkbook I had not touched in months, and the faint scent of dust that accompanies neglected responsibilities. I sat down and began to sort through the papers methodically, my movements slow but deliberate. Somewhere deep inside, the discipline that had carried me through countless emergencies was awakening again, reminding me that understanding a situation is the first step toward changing it. Outside the window, the sky shifted from pale blue to the muted gold of early evening, shadows lengthening across the yard like quiet warnings. Daniel passed by the desk without stopping, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed straight ahead. For an instant I considered calling his name, asking him the simple questions that hovered unspoken between us. Instead I watched him disappear into the living room, and listened to the murmur of the television rising to fill the silence. There would be time for questions later. For now what mattered was clarity. As I closed the drawer and folded my hands upon the worn wooden surface, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle into my chest. Not the calm of resignation but the focused calm that comes just before a difficult procedure begins. Whatever transformation was taking place within these walls was no longer something I could ignore. And for the first time since the ground beneath me had begun to shift, I sensed that my role in this unfolding story was changing in ways neither Daniel nor Ashley had yet imagined. I waited until the house grew quiet again before opening the worn leather planner I had carried with me through most of my working life, its edges softened by years of being slipped in and out of lockers, tote bags, and desk drawers. Inside were pages filled with careful handwriting, reminders of appointments long past, notes about medication schedules for patients whose faces I could still recall with surprising clarity. Routine had always been my shield, my way of bringing order to chaos, and now I turned to it once more, tracing dates with my fingertip as if they might reveal the path forward. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the staircase, illuminating faint scratches on the banister left from when Daniel had practiced sliding down it as a boy, his laughter echoing through the house like music I had never thought would fade. I sat at the small desk beneath those same stairs, listening to the muted rhythm of Ashley's voice drifting from the living room where she spoke on another phone call, her tone brisk and confident. Words like listing agent and competitive offer floated toward me, each one landing with the quiet weight of inevitability. Somewhere deep within my chest, a memory stirred with unexpected clarity, pulling me back decades to my first year as a nurse when a senior doctor had told me that the most dangerous moment in any emergency was not the arrival of crisis, but the false calm that often followed it. People assume the worst is over when the room falls silent. That is when you must pay the closest attention. I closed the planner gently and rose, drawn again toward the locked bedroom door that had become a silent witness to everything unfolding around me. The metal was cool beneath my fingertips, unyielding, a barrier that represented more than simple exclusion. Behind it lay not only my belongings but the life I had believed was secure, the life I had defended with every extra shift and sleepless night. I remembered walking into that room years earlier with my husband, paint samples in hand, debating whether the walls should be a soft cream or pale sage. We had laughed then, certain we had all the time in the world to make small decisions together. Now the hallway held only the faint echo of those choices, suspended like dust motes in the fading light. A sudden creak from the front porch signaled Daniel stepping outside, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as though he were carrying a burden he could not name. Through the window I watched him stand at the edge of the lawn, hands shoved into his pockets, staring down Maple Street with an expression I could not quite decipher. For a brief moment I considered joining him, bridging the distance that had grown between us with the simple offer of conversation. Yet instinct held me back. In medicine we learn that timing can determine everything, that intervening too soon can sometimes cause more harm than waiting for the full picture to emerge. Instead I turned toward the kitchen where the scent of reheated coffee lingered, poured myself a small cup, and stood by the sink studying the reflection of the backyard in the darkened glass. The garden was still there, stubbornly alive despite neglect, roses pushing through cool spring air with quiet determination. Their resilience felt like a message I was only beginning to understand. Behind me, Ashley's laughter rose again, light and triumphant, followed by the rustle of paperwork being sorted into neat piles. I could almost see her arranging the future with practiced precision, convinced that every variable had been accounted for. She did not notice the way I watched from the shadows, absorbing details the way I once memorized vital signs. There is a point in every long shift when fatigue gives way to a strange second wind, a clarity sharpened by necessity. As evening settled around the house and the first stars appeared faintly above the rooftops, I felt that clarity take hold. Whatever role I had played until now was no longer sufficient. The situation required more than endurance. It required understanding, strategy, and the quiet confidence of someone who had survived countless moments when others believed there was no hope left. I set the coffee cup aside and returned to the desk beneath the stairs, opening the bottom drawer this time, prepared to search not only for old bills and forgotten receipts but for anything that might help me piece together the truth they assumed I would never see. The drawer beneath the staircase resisted at first, as though it too had grown accustomed to being left undisturbed, and when it finally gave way with a soft wooden groan, a faint cloud of dust rose into the dim lamplight. Inside lay the quiet remnants of decisions once made in confidence. Warranty papers, tax returns folded with careful precision, an envelope containing the title insurance policy from the year my husband and I had purchased the house. I spread the documents across the desk one by one, aligning their edges instinctively, the same way I had arranged surgical instruments on sterile trays before assisting in complicated procedures. Organization had always been my first step toward control. Outside the living room window I could see Ashley's silhouette moving back and forth as she spoke on the phone, her gestures animated, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested certainty. She believed the outcome was already decided. Daniel's voice drifted in occasionally, lower, less confident, like a man trying to follow instructions he did not fully understand. I focused on the papers instead, tracing dates and signatures, letting the quiet discipline of reading legal language steady my thoughts. The title, policy, bore both my husband's name and mine, printed in bold serif letters that felt almost ceremonial. Beneath it lay a more recent document I did not recognize at first glance, the ink darker, the margins narrower, as if time itself had become more compressed. A notice from a financial institution I had never dealt with directly. I felt my pulse quicken but forced myself to continue at the same deliberate pace. In medicine we were taught that sudden movement could startle even the calmest patient. Precision mattered. Clarity mattered. From the kitchen came the sharp click of a cabinet door, followed by Ashley's laughter, bright and dismissive, a sound that seemed to skate across the surface of deeper truths. I remembered another laugh from years ago, my husband's voice echoing down this same hallway as he carried a box of medical textbooks into Daniel's room, telling him that education was the only inheritance that could never be taken away. That promise lingered now like a fragile thread connecting past and present. I unfolded the unfamiliar notice fully and read each line twice, allowing the meaning to settle slowly into place. A home equity line of credit had been opened 6 months earlier. Monthly statements had been sent electronically. Payments were listed in neat columns, each one confirming that someone had been shaping the future of this house without my knowledge. For a brief moment the room seemed to tilt, the edges of the desk blurring as if I had stood up too quickly after a long night shift. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, counting to 5 the way I had taught anxious patients waiting for test results. Fear can be managed. Information cannot be undone. When I looked up again, the world had regained its sharpness. Ashley entered the hallway just then, her heels clicking against the floor with quiet authority, a stack of glossy folders tucked beneath her arm. She paused when she saw the document spread before me, surprise flickering across her features before she replaced it with a practiced smile. "Just clearing out old clutter," she said lightly, though her gaze lingered on the title policy longer than necessary. Daniel appeared behind her, his expression unreadable, as though he were observing a scene from a distance rather than participating in it. I nodded once, folding the notice back into its envelope with steady hands. Years in the emergency room had taught me that confrontation without preparation only leads to louder chaos. There would be time to ask questions later, time to reveal what I was beginning to understand. For now, silence remained my most reliable ally. As Ashley turned away, already dialing another number, I gathered the remaining papers into a neat stack and returned them to the drawer, keeping only the envelope in my lap. Outside, twilight had deepened into a soft indigo, the first porch lights flickering on up and down Maple Street like signals in a code I was only beginning to decipher. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the distant murmur of traffic and the faint rustle of wine through the garden roses, aware that something fundamental had shifted within me. This was no longer simply about a locked door or a rearranged room. It was about the quiet transfer of power that happens when trust is mistaken for permission. And as I rose from the desk and slipped the envelope into the pocket of my cardigan, I felt the familiar steadiness of purpose returning, the same resolve that had carried me through countless nights when others had already given up hope. Morning arrived with a pale gray sky that seemed undecided about whether it would rain, and I rose before the rest of the house stirred, moving quietly through the hallway like a visitor determined not to disturb anyone. The envelope rested in the pocket of my cardigan, its thin edges pressing gently against my side, a constant reminder that what I had discovered the night before was not a misunderstanding or a moment of grief-fueled confusion. It was a plan. I stepped onto the front porch with a mug of weak coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up in slow familiar patterns. A delivery truck rumbled past, its tires hissing on damp pavement. Mrs. Holloway from 2 houses down bent to retrieve her newspaper, waving absent-mindedly in my direction without noticing how different everything had begun to feel. For years I had believed that stability was something you built brick by brick, shift by shift, sacrifice by sacrifice. Now I was beginning to understand how quickly it could be dismantled in quiet conversations I was never meant to hear. Inside, Ashley's alarm chimed faintly, followed by the steady rhythm of footsteps crossing the bedroom floor. She now shared with Daniel, a space that had once held laughter, whispered plans, and the simple certainty of belonging. I sipped the coffee and let its bitterness anchor me, reminding myself of countless early mornings spent preparing for long hospital days when exhaustion was simply another obstacle to be managed. Discipline had always been my refuge. When Ashley finally appeared in the doorway, dressed in tailored slacks and holding her phone like a shield, she seemed momentarily surprised to see me already awake. "You are up early," she said, her voice light but edged with curiosity. I nodded, offering the faint smile I had practiced in mirrors before delivering difficult news to worried families. "Old habits," I replied. "Hospitals do not run on a late schedule." She studied me for a moment longer, perhaps searching for signs of resistance or confrontation, then turned away with a small shrug as though reassured that I remained predictable. Daniel followed her out minutes later, his tie half knotted, his expression drawn. He paused beside the porch railing, glancing toward the garden as if it might offer him guidance. For an instant I thought he might speak, might acknowledge the widening distance between us. Instead he cleared his throat and asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The question hung in the air like an apology he could not quite form. "No," I said gently. "I have everything I need." The truth of that statement surprised even me. After they left for work, the house fell into a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate. I moved through each room with measured steps, noting the subtle rearrangements that continued to unfold. A stack of my cookbooks had been relocated to the pantry shelf. The photo of my husband at our 40th anniversary dinner was gone from the mantel, replaced by a minimalist sculpture I did not recognize. Change was advancing inch by inch, the way a fever rises gradually before breaking into full intensity. I returned to the desk beneath the staircase and withdrew the envelope once more, smoothing its creases as though it were a fragile prescription I dared not misread. The bank's letterhead seemed more imposing in daylight, the printed figures sharper, more undeniable. Somewhere in the back of my mind, training took over again, guiding me toward the next logical step. Gather evidence. Confirm assumptions. Prepare a response. I located an old contact list tucked into the planner, its pages yellowed but still legible, and traced a familiar name with my fingertip. Mr. Carter had been our family attorney for nearly 20 years, a careful man who believed in facts more than feelings. The memory of his steady handshake returned to me with unexpected clarity. Outside, clouds began to gather over Maple Street, dimming the morning sun and casting long thoughtful shadows across the yard. I realized then that patience alone would not restore what had been quietly taken. Action would be required, precise and measured, like the insertion of an intravenous line at exactly the right moment. I closed the planner, slipped the envelope back into my pocket, and rose from the desk with a calm I had not felt since the first metallic click of the padlock had echoed through the hallway. Whatever they believed about my role in this house, they had underestimated one simple truth. A nurse does not stop observing when she leaves the hospital. She only learns to apply the same vigilance in places where no one expects it. The call to Mr. Carter's office took less than a minute, yet it felt like stepping across an invisible threshold I could not return from. His receptionist recognized my voice immediately, her tone softening with genuine concern as she scheduled an appointment for the following morning. When I hung up the phone, the house seemed to listen with me, its quiet corners suddenly filled with a new kind of awareness. I spent the afternoon moving through familiar routines with deliberate care, wiping down kitchen counters that no longer felt like mine, watering the roses my husband had once tended every Sunday without fail. The air carried the faint promise of rain, heavy clouds pressing low over Maple Street, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. When Daniel and Ashley returned from work, I was seated at the dining table with a legal pad and pen, copying down account numbers and dates from the documents I had begun to study. Ashley paused in the doorway, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly before she arranged it into polite surprise. "Doing some organizing?" she asked, placing her purse on the counter with a quiet thud. I nodded, meeting her gaze calmly. "I have always believed that clarity begins with good records." Daniel hovered behind her, his shoulders slightly hunched, the familiar crease between his brows deepening as he glanced at the pages spread before me. For a moment I saw the boy who once needed help tying his shoelaces, uncertain and eager to please. Then Ashley's hand found his arm, guiding him gently toward the living room as though the conversation had already ended. Their voices drifted back to me in fragments, the television volume rising just enough to blur whatever words might have followed. Later that evening, Ashley announced that a real estate agent would be visiting the house on Saturday to discuss future possibilities, her tone bright with anticipation. She spoke as though I were a distant relative invited to observe rather than someone whose life was woven into every beam and brick. I listened without interruption, my pen moving steadily across the paper as I continued to make notes. In the hospital we often prepared for procedures days in advance, assembling information piece by piece until the final moment arrived. Preparation was not panic. Preparation was power. After dinner, which I ate alone at the kitchen table while they discussed paint samples in the next room, I returned to the guest bedroom and opened my planner once more. The appointment with Mr. Carter was circled in firm blue ink, a small promise that tomorrow would bring answers no one else in this house was expecting. Rain began to fall sometime after midnight, tapping softly against the window like a patient knock I was finally ready to answer. I lay awake listening to it, recalling countless nights spent monitoring vital signs while families slept in waiting rooms, trusting that someone would remain vigilant on their behalf. Vigilance had become my second nature. Before dawn I dressed carefully in the navy suit I had worn to my husband's memorial service, smoothing the fabric as though armor could be fashioned from simple cloth. When Ashley noticed me preparing to leave, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing, perhaps assuming I was visiting a friend or running an errand that would soon fade into insignificance. Daniel offered a distracted wave as he checked his messages, already half absorbed in a world that no longer included my counsel. The drive to Mr. Carter's office felt strangely familiar, the rhythm of traffic lights and passing storefronts echoing the countless commutes I had made during my working years. By the time I parked beneath the oak trees lining his building's entrance, the rain had stopped and sunlight broke through in thin hopeful rays. I sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, aware that whatever conversation awaited me inside would alter the course of everything that followed. Then I stepped out of the car, carrying the envelope close against my side, and walked toward the door with the steady determination of someone who had finally decided that silence was no longer enough. I stepped into Mr. Carter's office with the same composed expression I had worn countless times while walking into examination rooms where uncertainty waited like an uninvited guest. The scent of polished wood and fresh paper greeted me, grounding me in the familiar reality that decisions made within these walls carried weight far beyond polite conversation. He rose from behind his desk with genuine warmth, his silver hair neatly combed, his handshake firm in a way that reminded me of steadiness rather than control. We sat across from each other in quiet understanding while I placed the envelope before him, smoothing its edges one final time as though preparing a patient chart for review. He read every page carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each line, and when he finally looked up his eyes held a clarity that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The house was not simply being reorganized. It had been leveraged, negotiated, and positioned for sale without my informed consent. Yet the title policy still bore my name with legal strength that could not be erased by assumption or convenience. His voice remained calm as he explained my options, outlining steps that sounded less like confrontation and more like restoration. Documentation could halt proceedings. Formal notices could redefine timelines. Silence, he reminded me gently, does not equal surrender. As he spoke, I felt a strange lightness settle over me, the kind that comes when a diagnosis finally transforms fear into strategy. By the time I left his office, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the pavement beneath my shoes, and the world seemed sharper, more defined. I drove home with the windows slightly open, letting spring air move through the car like a quiet promise that change was not always loss. When I pulled into the driveway, Ashley's sedan was already there, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sky. Inside, the living room buzzed with activity. A tall man in a tailored blazer stood near the fireplace, gesturing toward the ceiling as he spoke about renovation potential and market trends. Ashley listened attentively, nodding with professional enthusiasm, while Daniel hovered beside her, his smile strained but determined. They turned when I entered, surprise flickering across their faces like a sudden shadow. I greeted the visitor politely and set my handbag on the console table, noting how the absence of my photographs left the space feeling like a stage set waiting for new actors. Ashley began to explain their plans in bright, confident tones, describing open houses and competitive offers as though narrating a future already secured. I allowed her to finish, then reached calmly into my bag and withdrew a single folded document. The paper made a soft whispering sound as I placed it on the coffee table between us, its official letterhead unmistakable. Mr. Carter's notice outlined the legal reality they had chosen to overlook, stating clearly that no sale or refinancing could proceed without my authorization. The room fell into a silence more profound than any raised voice. Daniel's eyes moved from the document to my face, searching for anger he did not find. Ashley's composure wavered for the first time since I had known her, her fingers tightening slightly around the real estate brochure she still held. I did not accuse. I did not explain. Years of practice had taught me that dignity often speaks louder than desperation. Instead, I met their gaze with the steady calm that had carried me through emergencies far more chaotic than this living room. Outside, a breeze stirred the garden roses, sending a few pale petals drifting across the lawn like quiet witnesses to the shift unfolding within these walls. The agent cleared his throat and stepped back, suddenly aware he had become part of a story he did not understand. I gathered my bag and moved toward the hallway, pausing only once beside the locked bedroom door whose brass surface now reflected something new in my eyes. Not defeat. Not fear. Only resolve. Behind me, voices rose in urgent whispers, the sound of plans unraveling thread by careful thread. I did not need to turn around to know that the balance of power had begun to change. Some battles are not won with noise or force. They are won with patience, preparation, and the quiet certainty that truth, once revealed, has a way of opening even the most stubbornly locked doors.